In the year 1962, India and China fought a war in some of the most remote and inhospitable terrain on Earth. Among the earliest and most significant clashes of that war was the Battle of Galwan. To truly understand why the fighting broke out in this remote valley of Ladakh, we need to go back a few years and look at how India and China's relations deteriorated in the lead-up to the war. When India became independent in 1947, it inherited undefined and disputed borders in the Himalayas. These were lines drawn in colonial times, often on maps rather than on the ground. For centuries, the high-altitude passes of Aksai, Chin, and Ladakh were lightly policed, more natural frontiers than militarized boundaries. But this changed after 1950, when China asserted control over Tibet. Suddenly, India and China became direct neighbors, and the long and vague boundary between them became a matter of national security for both countries. The first signs of friction appeared in the 1950s, when China secretly built a road through Aksai Chin to connect its regions of Xinjiang and Tibet. India discovered this only in 1957, and it was a shock because India also claimed Aksai Chin as part of Ladakh. Despite initial attempts to resolve the issue diplomatically, relations steadily worsened. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's government pursued what came to be called the forward policy. This meant that Indian troops would set up small posts in disputed areas, even in places where China already had a presence, in order to assert India's territorial claims. One such post was established in the Galwan Valley in July 1962. This valley, lying at an altitude of over 14,000 feet, was strategically important because it connected to routes leading into Aksai Chin. Indian soldiers of the 5 Jat Regiment and later men from the 1/8th Gorkha Rifles were tasked with holding this isolated post. But once it was established, Chinese troops quickly moved to surround it. The situation at Galwan soon became a siege. Indian soldiers were supplied by airdrops because the Chinese had cut off ground access. The men lived in freezing conditions, with limited supplies and no chance of relief by land. Tensions were at their peak, with both sides accusing each other of intruding into their territory. Chinese forces, much larger in number, repeatedly demanded that the Indian post be withdrawn. New Delhi, however, insisted that the post would remain, as pulling back would be seen as conceding Indian territory. For weeks, the soldiers at Galwan held their ground. The standoff became symbolic of the larger India-China confrontation. And then on the 20th of October 1962, when China launched its full-scale offensive across the Himalayas, Galwan was one of the first targets. The Chinese assault began with heavy small arms fire and waves of troops attacking the Indian position. The defenders, cut off and heavily outnumbered, fought back with determination. They held their ground for hours, inflicting casualties on the attackers, but the odds were overwhelming. Eventually, the Chinese broke through the defenses and the post was overrun. Many Indian soldiers were killed in the fighting, while others were captured and taken prisoner. The fall of Galwan was not an isolated event. Across the Ladakh sector and the Northeast Frontier Agency, Indian forward posts faced similar fates. The Indian Army's forward policy had left many small units stranded, unable to support each other, and vulnerable to coordinated Chinese offensives. When the war ended on the 21st of November 1962, after China declared a unilateral ceasefire, India had suffered heavy losses. China retained control over Aksai Chin, and the Galwan Valley remained under its influence. For India, the memory of Galwan was part of a larger national trauma, the realization that the country was unprepared for the scale of Chinese military power. Yet the story of Galwan did not end in 1962. The valley would reappear in global headlines almost 60 years later, in 2020, when Indian and Chinese soldiers clashed there once again. Though the circumstances were very different, the name Galwan reminded both nations of the unfinished history of their disputed border.